The grandfather clock in the corner of Lady Ashworth's ballroom had just struck midnight when Miss Clara Whitby made her decision. Tonight would be her final appearance in London society. At 31, she had endured 13 years of rejection, mockery, and deliberate cruelty, and she simply could not bear another moment of it. She sat alone in the alcove that had become her customary refuge at these gatherings, a shadowy corner where the wallflowers and forgotten spinsters were relegated, far from the glittering center of the ballroom where eligible young ladies danced with handsome gentlemen. Her plain brown silk gown, carefully mended and altered to hide its age, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, making her nearly invisible among the potted palms and marble statuary. "Look at her," Lady Pemberton's voice carried clearly across the space between them, pitched just loud enough for Clara to hear every poisonous word. Still attending balls at her age. One would think she'd have accepted reality by now. "Quite pathetic, really," Mrs. Ashworth agreed with obvious satisfaction. 31 and still harboring delusions that some gentleman might suddenly discover her charms. The poor creature doesn't seem to understand that some women are simply not meant for marriage. Clara's fingers tightened on the book of poetry she always carried to these events, her shield against the endless hours of being ignored, or worse, actively mocked. She had learned long ago not to react to such comments, not to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing how deeply their words wounded her. The truth was that Clara Whitby had once been different. At 18, she had possessed a quiet beauty and gentle manner that had attracted several respectable suitors. Her family had been well regarded, her father a baronet with a modest but comfortable fortune, her future seemingly secure, but that was before the scandals began. First, her father's gambling debts had surfaced, revealing years of financial mismanagement that had left the family nearly destitute. Then her brother Charles had been caught cheating at cards and challenged to a duel that ended with his exile to the continent. Finally, her mother had been discovered in a very public affair with a married politician, creating a scandal that had destroyed any remaining shred of the family's reputation. One by one, Clara's suitors had disappeared, their families unwilling to associate with the Whitby name. Invitations had stopped arriving, friends had begun crossing the street to avoid her, and Clara had found herself transformed from a promising young lady into society's most pitiable spinster. Now, 13 years later, she existed on the periphery of the ton, tolerated only because her elderly aunt, Lady Thornfield, insisted on including her in social gatherings. Clara served as her aunt's companion, a role that required her presence at events where she was universally ignored or openly mocked. "I do wonder why Lady Thornfield continues to drag her along," Lady Pemberton continued, her voice growing louder as she warmed to her subject. "Surely even she must realize that Miss Whitby's presence is rather dampening to the festivities. Perhaps she hopes someone will take pity on the creature," Mrs. Ashworth suggested with a laugh that held no warmth, "though I cannot imagine what sort of man would be desperate enough to consider such a match." Clara closed her eyes against the familiar sting of tears, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. She would finish this evening with what little dignity she had left, return to her aunt's house, and tomorrow she would write to her cousin in Yorkshire. Margaret had offered her a position as governess to her children, and while the prospect of exile from London felt like a kind of death, it would be preferable to enduring any more nights like this one. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice the tall figure approaching her alcove until a deep, cultured voice spoke directly to her. "Miss Whitby, I believe." Clara's eyes flew open to find herself staring up at the most imposing man she had ever encountered. Frederick Langston, Duke of Ravenshollow, stood before her like something from a fairy tale, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of austere handsomeness that spoke of generations of noble breeding. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples. His steel-grey eyes held an intelligence that was both intimidating and compelling, and his entire bearing radiated the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. At 38, he was perhaps the most powerful man in England, wealthy beyond measure, politically influential, and possessed of a dukedom that traced its lineage back 3 centuries. He had been widowed for 5 years, since his beloved wife Eleanor had died in childbirth, and society had been waiting ever since for him to choose a new duchess. But the Duke had shown no interest in remarriage, attending social functions out of duty rather than pleasure. His presence was both coveted and feared in equal measure. Coveted because an invitation that included the Duke of Ravenshollow was a mark of the highest social distinction, and feared because his standards were impossibly high and his displeasure could destroy a reputation overnight. "Your Grace," Clara stammered, struggling to rise from her chair with some semblance of grace. Yes, I am Miss Whitby, though I confess I am surprised that you know my name. I make it my business to know the names of all the ladies present at these gatherings, Frederick replied with a slight smile that transformed his austere features, though I must admit I have been particularly curious about you. Clara felt her heart skip a beat at his words, though she was certain she must have misunderstood. Curious about me, Your Grace? I cannot imagine why. Because, Frederick said, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, in a room full of people desperately trying to attract attention, you are the only one who seems content to remain unnoticed. I find that intriguing. Before Clara could formulate a response to such an extraordinary statement, Frederick extended his hand toward her, with the same courtesy he might show to a duchess. Miss Whitby, would you honour me with a dance? The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that had fallen over their corner of the ballroom. Clara was dimly aware that several nearby conversations had stopped, that curious faces were turning toward them, but all of that faded into insignificance beside the impossibility of what was happening. The Duke of Ravenshollow was asking her to dance. Her, Clara Whitby, the despised spinster whom no gentleman had approached in over a decade. Your Grace, there must be some mistake, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Surely you intended to ask someone else. No mistake, Frederick replied firmly, his hand remaining steady before her. I am asking you, Miss Clara Whitby, to dance with me. Will you accept? Clara stared at his outstretched hand as though it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She was acutely aware of the shocked whispers that were beginning to spread through the ballroom, of the incredulous stares and barely concealed gasps of amazement. Lady Pemberton looked as though she had been struck by lightning, while Mrs. Ashworth appeared to be choking on her champagne. Yes, Clara said finally, the word emerging as barely more than a breath. Yes, Your Grace, I would be honoured. The moment her gloved hand touched his, Clara felt as though an electric current had passed between them. Frederick's fingers were strong and warm, his touch gentle yet confident as he led her from the alcove toward the centre of the ballroom. The crowd parted before them like the Red Sea, every face reflecting varying degrees of shock, curiosity and speculation. Clara was dimly aware of the orchestra beginning a new waltz, of the other dancers clearing the floor to watch the unprecedented spectacle of the Duke of Ravenshollow dancing with the woman they had all dismissed as a hopeless spinster. You're trembling, Frederick observed quietly, as he placed his hand at her waist and drew her into the opening steps of the dance. I'm terrified, Clara admitted honestly, her voice shaking with emotion. I haven't danced it's been years, Your Grace. I'm certain to embarrass both of us. Then we shall be embarrassed together, Frederick said with a smile that made her heart race. Though I suspect you underestimate yourself, Miss Whitby. He was right. Despite her fears, Clara's body remembered the lessons of her youth, and she moved with a natural grace that complemented Frederick's own elegant steps. As they swept across the polished floor, she felt as though she were flying rather than dancing, her brown silk gown transforming into something magical under the light of the crystal chandeliers. You dance beautifully, Frederick said, his voice pitched for her ears alone. I was right to trust my instincts about you. Your instincts, Your Grace. I have been watching you this evening, Miss Whitby. Watching the way you carry yourself with dignity despite the cruelty of others, the way you find solace in literature rather than gossip, the way you observe the world around you with intelligence and compassion. These are rare qualities in our society. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes at his unexpected words of praise. Your Grace, you are very kind, but I fear you see qualities in me that don't truly exist. On the contrary, Frederick replied, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I believe you consistently underestimate your own worth. Tell me, Miss Whitby, what do you see when you look in the mirror? The question caught Clara off guard, and she found herself answering with painful honesty. I see a woman who has been weighed and found wanting, Your Grace, a spinster past her prime, marked by scandal, suitable only for the shadows. Then you need better mirrors, Frederick said firmly, because I see a woman of remarkable strength who has endured years of undeserved cruelty with grace and dignity. I see intelligence, compassion, and a beauty that has nothing to do with youth or fashion and everything to do with character. As the music began to wind toward its conclusion, Clara felt as though she were awakening from a long, dark dream. For the first time in 13 years, someone was seeing her, truly seeing her, and finding her worthy of respect and admiration. Your Grace, she said softly, as he led her back toward the edge of the ballroom, Might I ask why you chose to dance with me tonight? Surely there are many other ladies who would provide more suitable partners for a man of your position." Frederick paused at the edge of the dance floor, his hand still holding hers as he considered her question. "Miss Whitby, I have spent the past 5 years being pursued by every eligible woman in London. They have offered me beauty, accomplishments, connections, and fortunes. But not one of them has offered me what I saw in you tonight: genuine character, unaffected grace, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from surviving adversity without becoming bitter." Clara stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. "But Your Grace, I am hardly suitable." "You are exactly suitable," Frederick interrupted gently. "Miss Whitby, would you permit me to call upon you tomorrow afternoon? I find myself most eager to continue our conversation in a setting where we might speak more freely." The request hung in the air between them, so impossible and wonderful that Clara was certain she must have misunderstood. The Duke of Ravenshollow wanted to call upon her. It was beyond the realm of possibility, a dream so far-fetched that she couldn't even have imagined it. Your Grace, I don't think, that is, I'm not certain my aunt would," Clara stammered, unable to form a coherent response to such an extraordinary proposition. "Then perhaps we should ask her," Frederick suggested with a smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Lady Thornfield, if I may." Clara turned to see her elderly aunt approaching, her face a mask of bewilderment and barely concealed excitement. Lady Thornfield had been watching the unprecedented spectacle of her niece dancing with the Duke of Ravenshollow with the same expression one might wear while witnessing a miracle. "Your Grace," Lady Thornfield said with a deep curtsy that emphasized both her respect for his rank and her amazement at his attention to Clara. "What an extraordinary honor you have bestowed upon my niece this evening." "The honor has been entirely mine, Lady Thornfield," Frederick replied with perfect courtesy. "Your niece is a remarkable young woman, and I have requested permission to call upon her tomorrow afternoon. I trust you would have no objection to such a visit." Lady Thornfield's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to find her voice. "Your Grace, that is, of course, we would be most honored to receive you." "Excellent. Miss Whitby, shall we say 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock would be perfect, Your Grace," Clara managed to reply, though she felt as though she were speaking from inside a dream. Frederick took her hand and raised it to his lips for a brief, formal kiss that sent shivers through her entire body. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Whitby. I look forward to our meeting with great anticipation." As he took his leave with a bow that was both formal and respectful, Clara stood frozen in place, watching his tall figure disappear into the crowd. The ballroom around her had erupted into a frenzy of whispered conversations and shocked speculation, but all of that seemed to fade into the background beside the extraordinary reality of what had just occurred. "Clara, my dear," Lady Thornfield said, her voice trembling with excitement, "I believe we must discuss what gown you shall wear tomorrow. The Duke of Ravenshollow is calling upon you. I can hardly believe it." But Clara was barely listening to her aunt's excited chatter. Her mind was reeling from the events of the evening, from the impossible transformation that had taken her from the shadows to the center of attention in the space of a single dance. For the first time in 13 years, Clara Whitby felt visible. For the first time since her youth, she felt valued and desired for who she truly was, rather than dismissed for who she was not. The spinster scorned by high society had somehow captured the attention of the most powerful duke in England, and her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. As her aunt led her toward their carriage, still chattering excitedly about the duke's unprecedented attention, Clara allowed herself to hope, for the first time in years, that perhaps her story wasn't over after all. Perhaps the most beautiful love story was just beginning. The morning after Clara woke the next morning with the disorienting sensation that she had dreamed the entire extraordinary evening. Surely she couldn't have actually danced with the Duke of Ravenshollow. Surely he couldn't have requested permission to call upon her. The whole episode must have been a product of her imagination, brought on by too much stress and too little hope. But as she sat up in her narrow bed in her aunt's modest townhouse, the events of the previous night came flooding back with crystal clarity. She could still feel the strength of Frederick's hand at her waist, still hear the warmth in his voice as he spoke of her character and worth, still see the intensity in his grey eyes as he looked at her as though she were someone precious. "Clara!" Lady Thornfield's voice rang through the house with uncharacteristic energy. "Clara, come quickly. We have much to discuss before His Grace arrives." The reality of the situation hit Clara like a physical blow. The Duke of Ravenshollow was indeed coming to call, and she had absolutely no idea how to prepare for such an unprecedented event. What did one wear when receiving the most eligible man in England? How did one behave? What did one say? She dressed quickly in her best morning gown, a simple but well-made dress of deep green wool that brought out the colour of her eyes, and made her way downstairs to find Lady Thornfield in a state of barely controlled panic. "Oh, my dear Clara," her aunt exclaimed, wringing her hands as she surveyed the modest drawing-room. "Whatever are we to do? The Duke of Ravenshollow, here, in our little house. The furniture is so shabby, the carpets so worn. What will he think?" "Aunt Thornfield," Clara said gently, placing a calming hand on the elderly woman's arm, "I'm certain His Grace is not coming to inspect our furnishings. If he truly wishes to call upon me, then he must already be aware of our modest circumstances." "But, Clara, you must understand what this means," Lady Thornfield continued, her voice rising with excitement. "The Duke of Ravenshollow has shown you particular attention. This could change everything for our family." Clara felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. She had spent so many years being disappointed, so many years having her hopes raised only to be crushed, that she couldn't allow herself to believe that Frederick's interest was anything more than a momentary whim. "Aunt, please don't read too much into this," she said quietly. "His Grace was merely being kind last evening. I'm certain his call today is nothing more than a polite gesture, a way of acknowledging our introduction without causing further speculation." "Nonsense," Lady Thornfield declared. "Dukes do not dance with spinsters out of mere politeness, my dear. There must be something more to this." But Clara had learned through bitter experience not to trust in hope, not to allow herself to believe that good things might actually happen to her. It was safer to assume that Frederick's interest would prove to be temporary, that he would realize his mistake and withdraw his attention before she could become too attached to the possibility of happiness. The hours until 3 o'clock passed, with agonizing slowness. Clara changed her dress 3 times, rearranged her hair twice, and spent considerable time staring at herself in the mirror, trying to see whatever it was that had caught Frederick's attention the night before. What she saw was a woman of 31 with pleasant but unremarkable features, chestnut brown hair that had lost the shine of youth, green eyes that held too much sadness, and a figure that was neither fashionably slender nor attractively voluptuous. She was, she concluded, exactly what she had always been: ordinary, forgettable, and entirely unsuitable for a duke. At precisely 3 o'clock, the sound of an elegant carriage drawing up outside their modest townhouse announced Frederick's arrival. Clara's heart began to race as she heard his footsteps on the front path, the murmur of voices as their elderly butler admitted him, and finally his deep voice requesting to see Miss Whitby. "Miss Whitby," Frederick said as he entered their small drawing-room, his tall frame making the modest space seem even smaller than usual. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored coat of dark blue superfine, his silver-touched hair gleaming in the afternoon light, and his presence seemed to fill the room with an energy that made Clara's pulse quicken. "Your Grace," Clara replied with a curtsy, acutely aware of how plain and simple her surroundings must appear to a man accustomed to the finest of everything. "How kind of you to call. Please, won't you sit down?" Frederick settled into the chair she indicated, with the same natural grace he had displayed on the dance floor, his grey eyes never leaving her face. "I trust you slept well after last evening's festivities." Yes, thank you, Your Grace," Clara replied, though the truth was that she had barely slept at all, her mind too full of questions and impossible hopes to allow for rest. "I'm glad to hear it. I confess I found myself thinking about our conversation long into the night." Clara felt her heart skip a beat at his words, though she tried to maintain her composure. "Our conversation, Your Grace? Indeed, I found myself curious about the woman behind the reputation that society has imposed upon you. Tell me, Miss Whitby, what do you do with your time when you're not attending social functions?" The question surprised Clara with its directness and genuine interest. Most people, when they bothered to speak to her at all, limited their conversation to polite pleasantries about the weather or the latest social gossip. I read a great deal, Your Grace," she said hesitantly. "I help my aunt with her correspondence, and I suppose my life is rather quiet compared to most." "What do you read?" Frederick asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair with an expression of genuine interest. "Everything I can find," Clara admitted, her natural enthusiasm for the subject beginning to overcome her nervousness. "Poetry, novels, philosophy, history. I particularly enjoy the works of Mary Wollstonecraft, though I suppose that makes me rather unfashionable." Frederick's eyebrows rose in surprise. Wollstonecraft? That's an unusual choice for a young lady. What draws you to her writings? Clara hesitated, uncertain whether she should voice opinions that she knew most people would find shocking coming from a woman. But something in Frederick's expression encouraged her to speak honestly. I find her arguments about women's education and capabilities quite compelling, she said carefully. She suggests that women are not naturally inferior to men, but rather that they are made to appear so by the limitations society places upon them. It's a provocative idea. Indeed it is, Frederick agreed, his grey eyes lighting up with what appeared to be approval. And what is your opinion of her arguments? I believe she may be correct, Clara said, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to the subject. I have observed that many women possess intelligence and capabilities that are never acknowledged or developed because society expects them to be ornamental rather than useful. It seems a terrible waste of human potential. Frederick was quiet for a moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. Had she said too much? Revealed too much of her unfashionable opinions? Miss Whitby, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of something that sounded almost like wonder, you are a most remarkable woman. Your Grace, in 20 years of moving in society, I have rarely encountered a woman who was willing to express such thoughtful opinions, let alone one who had clearly given serious consideration to complex philosophical questions. Most ladies of my acquaintance limit their conversation to fashion and gossip. Clara felt a flush of pleasure at his words, though she tried to remain cautious. I fear my opinions make me rather unsuitable for polite society, Your Grace. Most people prefer their women to be more conventional. Then most people are fools, Frederick said firmly. Miss Whitby, might I ask you something rather personal? Clara nodded, though her heart began to race with apprehension. Why have you never married? And please don't give me some polite nonsense about not having met the right gentleman. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. The question hit Clara like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the painful reality of her situation. For a moment, she considered offering one of the polite evasions that she had perfected over the years, but something in Frederick's expression encouraged honesty. Because no one has ever wanted me enough to overlook my family's scandals, she said quietly, the words emerging with painful honesty. I had several suitors when I was younger before everything went wrong. But when the scandals broke, they all disappeared. And now I am 31, past the age when most men consider a woman marriageable and possessed of a reputation that makes me unsuitable for respectable society. Frederick's expression grew serious and he leaned forward in his chair. Miss Whitby, may I speak frankly? Of course, Your Grace. I believe you have been grievously wronged by society's judgment. You are not responsible for your family's mistakes, and the idea that you should be punished for them is both cruel and unjust. As for your age, 31 is hardly ancient, and I find that women of maturity often possess qualities that younger ladies lack: wisdom, depth of character, genuine conversation. Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes at his unexpected kindness. You are very generous, Your Grace, but the reality is that I am exactly what society has deemed me to be, a spinster past her prime, suitable only for the shadows. Then society is blind, Frederick said with quiet conviction. Miss Whitby, Clara, may I call you Clara? Clara's heart skipped a beat at the intimacy implied by his request. Yes, Your Grace, if you wish. Clara, I want you to understand something. Last night, when I saw you sitting alone in that corner, ignored and dismissed by people who are not worthy to speak your name, I saw something that has become increasingly rare in our world: genuine character. You have been tested by adversity and emerged with your dignity intact. That is not a small thing. But it doesn't change the facts of my situation, Clara pointed out, though her voice was softer now, touched by his words. Perhaps not, Frederick agreed, but it changes how I see you. Clara, I would very much like to continue our acquaintance if you would permit it. I find myself curious about your thoughts on a great many subjects, and I believe you might find our conversations equally engaging. Clara stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Your Grace, I would be honored by your continued attention, but I must ask, why? Why would a man of your position and prospects choose to associate with someone like me? Frederick was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because, Clara, I have spent the past 5 years being pursued by women who see only my title and fortune. They offer me beauty, accomplishments, and connections, but they have no interest in my thoughts, my opinions, or my character. You are the first woman I have met who seems to value intelligence over appearance, substance over style. That is, refreshing. But surely you must want more than intellectual companionship, Clara said, her practical nature asserting itself. A man in your position needs a wife who can fulfill the social obligations of a duchess, who can move in the highest circles with confidence and grace. I am hardly suitable for such a role. Are you not? Frederick asked, raising an eyebrow. You carry yourself with natural dignity, you speak with intelligence and thoughtfulness, and you possess a strength of character that many so-called suitable ladies lack entirely. I believe you underestimate yourself, Clara. Before Clara could respond, Lady Thornfield appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement and barely concealed curiosity. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but I wondered if you might care for some refreshment. Tea, perhaps? Or some of our cook's excellent seed cake? That would be delightful, Lady Thornfield, Frederick replied with perfect courtesy. Your hospitality is most kind. As Lady Thornfield bustled away to arrange for tea, Frederick turned back to Clara with a smile that made her heart race. Clara, I have a proposition for you. A proposition, Your Grace. I would like to invite you to drive with me tomorrow afternoon in Hyde Park. It's the fashionable hour, and I believe it would be beneficial for you to be seen in my company. Clara felt her pulse quicken at the implications of his suggestion. To be seen driving with the Duke of Ravenshollow during the fashionable hour would be tantamount to a public declaration of his interest in her. It would transform her social standing overnight, but it would also expose her to scrutiny and speculation that she wasn't certain she could handle. Your Grace, Such attention would certainly cause talk, she said hesitantly. Indeed it would, Frederick agreed with a smile. The question is whether you are brave enough to face that talk, or whether you prefer to remain hidden in the shadows. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Clara felt something stir within her, a spark of the courage she had thought long dead. Yes, she said quietly, the word emerging with more strength than she had expected. Yes, Your Grace, I would be honored to drive with you. Excellent, I shall call for you at 4 o'clock. As Frederick took his leave after tea, promising to return the following day, Clara stood at the window, watching his elegant carriage disappear down the street. Her mind was reeling from the events of the afternoon, from the impossible reality that the Duke of Ravenshollow had not only called upon her, but had actually seemed to enjoy her company. Clara, my dear, Lady Thornfield said, appearing at her elbow with obvious excitement, I believe we must discuss what you shall wear tomorrow. The Duke of Ravenshollow, driving in Hyde Park, during the fashionable hour. Do you realize what this means? Clara did realize what it meant, and the knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. Tomorrow she would no longer be invisible. Tomorrow she would be the center of attention, the subject of speculation and gossip throughout London society. But for the first time in 13 years, she found herself looking forward to the attention rather than dreading it. Frederick had seen something in her worth valuing, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was time for her to see it too. The spinster, scorned by high society, was about to step into the light, and her transformation was only just beginning. Into the light. The following afternoon, Clara stood before her bedroom mirror in a state of nervous anticipation that bordered on panic. Lady Thornfield had insisted on lending her the finest gown in the house, a dress of deep sapphire blue silk that had belonged to Clara's late mother and had been carefully preserved in lavender and tissue paper for over a decade. The gown was slightly out of fashion, but the rich color brought out the green of Clara's eyes and complemented her chestnut hair beautifully. With the addition of her mother's pearl necklace and matching earrings, she looked more elegant than she had in years. You look absolutely beautiful, my dear, Lady Thornfield said with tears in her eyes. Your mother would be so proud to see you now. Clara studied her reflection critically, still struggling to see herself as anything other than the plain spinster she had believed herself to be for so many years. But there was something different about her appearance today, a spark in her eyes, a confidence in her posture that hadn't been there before. Do you think I look suitable for driving with a duke? She asked hesitantly. My dear Clara, you look like a duchess yourself, Lady Thornfield declared with satisfaction. His Grace will be quite overcome by your beauty. At precisely 4 o'clock, the sound of an elegant carriage drawing up outside announced Frederick's arrival. Clara's heart began to race as she heard his footsteps on the front path, and she had to take several deep breaths to calm her nerves before making her way downstairs. Frederick was waiting in the small drawing room, magnificent in a perfectly tailored coat of dark green superfine that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. When he saw Clara descending the stairs, his grey eyes lit up with unmistakable admiration. "Miss Whitby," he said, offering a bow that was both formal and respectful, "you look absolutely radiant. That color is particularly becoming on you." "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara replied, accepting the pelisse and bonnet that Lady Thornfield had brought. "You are very kind." "Not kind, truthful," Frederick corrected as he helped her into her outer garments with a gentleness that made her pulse quicken. "Are you ready to face London society, Clara?" "As ready as I shall ever be," Clara replied, though her voice trembled slightly with nervousness. Frederick's curricle was a masterpiece of elegant engineering, drawn by a matched pair of chestnuts that danced with barely restrained energy. As he helped her into the high seat, Clara was acutely aware of the curious stares from passers-by who had gathered to witness the extraordinary sight of the Duke of Ravenshollow calling upon Miss Clara Whitby. "Ignore them," Frederick said quietly as he settled beside her and took up the reins. "Their opinions matter far less than they believe." As they drove through the fashionable streets of London toward Hyde Park, Clara found herself relaxing, despite her initial nervousness. Frederick proved to be an excellent conversationalist, drawing her out on subjects ranging from literature to current events, with a genuine interest that made her feel valued and intelligent. "Tell me about your childhood," Frederick said as they entered the park, where the fashionable world was already gathering for the daily ritual of seeing and being seen. "What was it like before your family's difficulties?" Clara smiled at the memory, her expression growing soft with nostalgia. "It was wonderful, actually. We lived in a lovely manor house in Kent, and my parents were very much in love. My father was passionate about his books and his estate. My mother was known for her charitable work, and my brother Charles was, well, he was charming and reckless, but we all adored him." "What changed?" Frederick asked gently. "My father's gambling began gradually," Clara said, her voice growing quieter. "At first, it seemed harmless, a few evenings at his club, some friendly wagers among gentlemen, but it became an obsession that consumed him. He mortgaged the estate, sold family heirlooms, borrowed against future income that never materialized." She paused, gathering her courage to continue with the painful story. "When Charles was caught cheating at cards, it was because he was trying to win back money to help father. The duel that followed, the other gentleman was wounded, and Charles was forced to flee to the continent. He's been in exile ever since." "And your mother?" "Found comfort in the arms of a man who promised to solve our financial problems," Clara said with a bitter smile. "Lord Hartwell was married, influential, and utterly without scruples. When their affair became public, it destroyed what little reputation our family had left." Frederick was quiet for a moment, processing the full scope of the tragedies that had befallen her family. "And through all of this, you remained strong." "I had no choice," Clara replied simply. "Someone had to maintain what dignity we had left. Someone had to care for my parents as they fell apart. I was the only one left." "That kind of strength is rare, Clara," Frederick said, his voice filled with admiration. "Most people would have been broken by such trials." "Perhaps I was broken," Clara said thoughtfully. "Perhaps I just learned to function despite the damage." As they entered the most fashionable section of Hyde Park, Clara became acutely aware of the sensation their appearance was creating. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as they passed. Fans fluttered frantically as ladies whispered behind them, and more than one gentleman nearly fell from his horse while staring at the unprecedented sight of the Duke of Ravenshollow driving with Miss Clara Whitby. "Your Grace!" Lady Pemberton called out from her own carriage, her voice carrying a note of barely concealed shock. "How delightful to see you this afternoon." Frederick brought his curricle to a stop beside Lady Pemberton's barouche, his expression perfectly polite, but somehow managing to convey his awareness of her previous cruelty toward Clara. "Lady Pemberton," he replied with a slight nod. "Indeed, it is a beautiful day for a drive. I believe you are acquainted with Miss Whitby?" The emphasis he placed on Clara's name was subtle, but unmistakable, and Lady Pemberton's face flushed with embarrassment as she remembered her cruel words from just 2 nights earlier. "Of course, Miss Whitby," Lady Pemberton stammered, her earlier venom replaced by obvious nervousness. How lovely you look this afternoon." "Thank you, Lady Pemberton," Clara replied with perfect composure, her voice carrying none of the hurt that woman's words had once caused her. "You are very kind." As they continued their circuit of the park, similar scenes played out repeatedly. People who had ignored or mocked Clara for years suddenly found themselves eager to acknowledge her, their attitudes transformed by the simple fact of Frederick's obvious favor. "It's remarkable," Clara observed, as they drove away from yet another group of suddenly solicitous acquaintances, "how quickly people's opinions can change when circumstances shift." Human nature, I'm afraid, Frederick replied with a slight smile. Most people are far more concerned with aligning themselves with power than with demonstrating genuine character. And yet you chose to align yourself with someone who had no power at all, Clara pointed out. Why? Frederick was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the reins as he considered her question. Because, Clara, I have learned that true worth has nothing to do with social position or public opinion. You possess qualities that cannot be bought or inherited. Integrity, courage, compassion, intelligence. These are the things that matter in the long term, not the fleeting approval of society. You speak as though you have personal experience with society's fickleness, Clara observed. I do, Frederick admitted. When Eleanor died, when I lost my son as well, I learned very quickly who my true friends were. Many people who had courted my favor when I was happy and successful suddenly found themselves too busy to call when I was grieving and broken. Clara felt her heart clench with sympathy for his loss. I'm so sorry, Frederick. I cannot imagine the pain of losing both a wife and child. It nearly destroyed me, Frederick said quietly. For the first year, I barely functioned. I went through the motions of my duties, but I felt nothing, cared about nothing. It was as though part of my soul had died with them. What brought you back? Clara asked gently. Time, mostly. And the realization that Eleanor would have been furious with me for wasting my life in grief. She was very practical about such things. She would have expected me to honor her memory by living fully, not by retreating from life. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was. But Clara, I want you to understand something. What I felt for Eleanor was the love of youth built on shared expectations and compatible temperaments. What I feel for you is different. Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. What you feel for me? Frederick brought the curricle to a stop in a quiet corner of the park, away from the crowds of fashionable society. He turned to face her fully, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Clara, I know this may seem sudden, but I must be honest with you. In the short time I have known you, you have awakened something in me that I thought had died with Eleanor. You make me feel alive again, make me want to be more than just a title and a fortune. Frederick, Clara began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Please let me finish. I know the obstacles we face, the difference in our social positions, the gossip and speculation that would follow any serious attachment between us. But I also know that I have never met anyone who challenges me intellectually, who sees past my title to the man beneath, who possesses the strength and character that I value above all else. Clara stared at him in amazement, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. Are you suggesting? I'm saying that I would very much like to court you properly, Clara. I want to know everything about you, your thoughts, your dreams, your fears, your hopes. I want to discover whether this connection I feel between us might develop into something deeper, something lasting. But Frederick, the scandal it would cause, Clara protested weakly, though her heart was racing with hope and excitement. Let them talk, Frederick said firmly. I am tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. I want to follow my heart for once, and my heart is telling me that you are exactly the woman I have been waiting for. And what if your heart is wrong? Clara asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if you discover that I am not the woman you think I am? What if the reality of a relationship with me proves disappointing? Then we will discover it together, Frederick replied, reaching out to take her gloved hand in his. Clara, I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow. I am asking you to give us both the chance to explore what might develop between us. Will you allow me to court you? Will you give us the opportunity to see where this connection might lead? Clara looked into his earnest grey eyes and saw sincerity, hope, and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. For 13 years, she had lived in the shadows, convinced that she was unworthy of love or happiness. But here was this extraordinary man, this powerful, wealthy, sought-after duke, offering her something she had never dared to dream of. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying all the hope and longing she had kept buried for so many years. Yes, Frederick, I would be honored to allow you to court me. The smile that spread across Frederick's face was radiant, transforming his austere features with pure joy. Without caring who might see them, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her gloved fingers. You have made me happier than I thought possible, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I promise you, Clara, that I will do everything in my power to prove worthy of the trust you have placed in me. As they drove back through the park toward her aunt's house, Clara felt as though she were floating, rather than sitting in a carriage. The woman who had entered the afternoon, convinced that she was destined for a life of loneliness and obscurity, was returning home as the object of the most eligible duke in England's romantic interest. The transformation was so complete, so unexpected, that she could barely process it. But as she glanced at Frederick's profile, noting the strength of his jaw and the intelligence in his grey eyes, she found herself beginning to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she was worthy of love after all. "Clara," Frederick said as they approached her aunt's street, "I want you to prepare yourself for the attention that will follow our public courtship. Society will be curious, speculative, and not always kind. Are you ready for that level of scrutiny?" "I have endured 13 years of society's cruelty," Clara replied with more confidence than she had felt in years. "I believe I can handle their curiosity, especially if I have your support." "You will always have my support," Frederick assured her as he helped her down from the curricle. "And Clara, tomorrow evening, Lady Ashworth is hosting a dinner party. I have already accepted her invitation, and I would very much like you to accompany me as my guest." Clara's eyes widened at the implications of such a public appearance together. "Frederick, that would be making a very public statement about your intentions." "Exactly," Frederick replied with a smile that made her heart race. "I want there to be no doubt about my regard for you, Clara. Will you come?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation, surprising herself with her boldness. "Yes, Frederick, I will be delighted to accompany you." As she watched his carriage disappear down the street, Clara felt a sense of anticipation and excitement that she hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow night, she would no longer be the invisible spinster hiding in the shadows. Tomorrow night, she would be the woman on the arm of the Duke of Ravenshollow, and London society would have no choice but to acknowledge her worth. The most beautiful love story was indeed just beginning, and Clara was finally ready to step into the light and claim her place in it. The dinner party. The following evening, Clara stood before her mirror in a state of nervous excitement that was entirely different from the anxiety she had felt just days earlier. Lady Thornfield had outdone herself in preparing for this momentous occasion, somehow managing to procure a gown that was both fashionable and flattering, a creation of deep emerald silk that brought out the colour of Clara's eyes and complemented her chestnut hair beautifully. "You look absolutely magnificent, my dear," Lady Thornfield declared as she fastened a necklace of emeralds and diamonds around Clara's throat, a family heirloom that had somehow escaped the creditors during their financial difficulties. "The Duke will be quite overcome when he sees you." Clara studied her reflection with growing amazement. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the plain spinster who had sat alone in corners just a week earlier. There was confidence in her posture, a sparkle in her green eyes, and an elegance to her bearing that spoke of inner transformation as much as outer enhancement. "I can hardly believe this is really happening," Clara murmured, touching the emerald necklace with trembling fingers. "A week ago, I was resigned to a life of invisibility, and now you are about to attend the most exclusive dinner party of the season, on the arm of the most eligible duke in England." Lady Thornfield finished with obvious satisfaction. "My dear Clara, you are about to take your rightful place in society." At precisely 7 o'clock, Frederick's carriage arrived, and Clara felt her heart race as she heard his footsteps on the front path. When she opened the door to greet him, the expression on his face made all her preparation worthwhile. "Clara," he said, his voice filled with unmistakable admiration, "you are absolutely breathtaking. That gown is perfection on you." "Thank you, Frederick," Clara replied, accepting the silk cloak he offered with hands that trembled only slightly. "I confess I am rather nervous about this evening." "There's no need to be nervous," Frederick assured her as he helped her into his elegant carriage. "You belong in these circles, Clara. You always have. Society simply failed to recognize it." The drive to Lady Ashworth's mansion passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation that helped ease Clara's remaining anxiety. Frederick had a gift for putting her at ease, for making her feel valued and intelligent, and by the time they arrived at their destination, she felt ready to face whatever the evening might bring. Lady Ashworth's townhouse was ablaze with light, and the sound of elegant conversation and laughter drifted from the open windows. As Frederick helped Clara from the carriage, she was acutely aware of the curious stares from other arriving guests, of the whispered conversations that followed their progress up the front steps. "Your Grace, Miss Whitby." Lady Ashworth greeted them at the door, her expression a carefully composed mask that couldn't quite hide her amazement at seeing Clara as Frederick's guest. "How delightful that you could join us this evening." "Lady Ashworth," Frederick replied with perfect courtesy. "Thank you for your invitation. I believe you know Miss Whitby." "Of course, Miss Whitby," Lady Ashworth said, her tone markedly different from the dismissive coldness she had shown Clara in the past. "How lovely you look this evening. That gown is absolutely exquisite." As they entered the drawing room, Clara felt every conversation pause as heads turned toward them. The sight of the Duke of Ravenshollow escorting Miss Clara Whitby was clearly the sensation of the evening, and she could feel the weight of dozens of curious stares. But instead of the familiar shrinking sensation she usually experienced under such scrutiny, Clara found herself standing taller, drawing strength from Frederick's presence beside her and from the growing confidence that his regard had given her. "Miss Whitby!" Lady Pemberton approached with a smile that was so different from her previous cruelty that Clara almost didn't recognize her. "How wonderful to see you again. I was just telling Mrs. Ashworth how much I enjoyed our conversation the other evening." Clara accepted the greeting with grace, though she couldn't help but remember that their previous conversation had consisted entirely of Lady Pemberton's cruel mockery. But she bore no grudges. Her happiness was too complete to be diminished by past slights. "Lady Pemberton," she replied warmly, "how kind of you to say so. I hope you are well this evening." As the evening progressed, Clara found herself the center of attention in a way she had never experienced before. People who had ignored her for years suddenly found themselves eager to engage her in conversation, to seek her opinions, to bask in the reflected glory of Frederick's obvious favor. "Miss Whitby," Lord Pemberton approached during the interval before dinner, "I understand you are quite well read. I should very much like your opinion on the new novel by Miss Austen." "I found Emma to be a fascinating study of self-deception and social observation," Clara replied, warming to the subject. "Miss Austen has a remarkable ability to reveal the complexities of human nature through seemingly simple social interactions." "Indeed!" Lord Pemberton exclaimed with obvious interest. "I confess I hadn't considered that perspective. You must tell me more about your interpretation." As Clara found herself drawn into an animated discussion about literature and social commentary, she became aware that Frederick was watching her with obvious pride and satisfaction. When their eyes met across the room, he smiled at her with such warmth that her heart skipped a beat. "You're enjoying yourself," he observed, when he managed to steal a moment alone with her before dinner was announced. "I am," Clara admitted with surprise. "For the first time in years, I feel as though I belong here, as though I have something valuable to contribute to the conversation." "You always had something valuable to contribute," Frederick said firmly. "The difference is that now people are finally listening." Dinner was a revelation for Clara. Seated at Frederick's right hand, a position that clearly indicated her importance as his guest, she found herself engaged in stimulating conversation with some of the most influential people in London. Her opinions were sought, her insights valued, and her intelligence recognized in a way that would have been impossible just a week earlier. "Miss Whitby," the Earl of Blackwood said during the fish course, "I understand you have strong opinions about social reform. I should very much like to hear your thoughts on the proposed changes to the poor laws." Clara felt a moment of nervousness. This was exactly the sort of topic that had once marked her as unsuitably radical, but Frederick's encouraging nod gave her the courage to speak honestly. "I believe the current system fails to address the root causes of poverty," she said carefully. "Rather than simply providing relief, we should be focusing on education and opportunity. If we could establish schools for working-class children, teach them to read and write, give them skills that would allow them to improve their circumstances." "An interesting perspective," Lord Blackwood mused. "And how would you propose to fund such schools?" "Through a combination of private charity and government support," Clara replied, her confidence growing as she warmed to the subject. "If wealthy families could be convinced that education for the poor would ultimately benefit society as a whole, reducing crime, increasing productivity, creating a more stable workforce, I believe many would be willing to contribute." The conversation that followed was animated and thoughtful, with several guests expressing genuine interest in Clara's ideas. She found herself at the center of a discussion about social policy that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, her opinions valued and respected by some of the most powerful people in England. "You were magnificent," Frederick murmured to her during a brief lull in the conversation. "I've never seen anyone command attention so naturally." "I feel as though I'm discovering a part of myself that I never knew existed," Clara replied softly. "For so many years I believed I had nothing of value to offer. But tonight you're showing everyone what I saw from the very beginning," Frederick said, his grey eyes warm with affection. You're showing them the remarkable woman you've always been. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to take their leave, Clara found herself surrounded by people eager to continue their acquaintance with her. Invitations were extended, calls were promised, and she realized with amazement that she had somehow transformed from a social pariah into one of the most sought-after women in London. "Miss Whitby," Lady Ashworth said as Clara and Frederick prepared to depart, "I do hope you will honour us with your presence at our musical next week. I believe you would find the conversation quite stimulating." "I would be delighted, Lady Ashworth," Clara replied with genuine pleasure. "Thank you for your kind invitation." As Frederick's carriage carried them through the quiet London streets toward her aunt's house, Clara felt as though she were living in a dream. The evening had exceeded her wildest expectations, transforming her from an overlooked spinster into a woman whose opinions were valued and whose company was sought. "Clara," Frederick said as they approached her street, "there's something I need to tell you." "What is it?" she asked, noting the serious tone in his voice. "Tonight, watching you shine in company, seeing how naturally you commanded respect and attention, it confirmed something I've been feeling since the moment we met." Clara's heart began to race as she absorbed the implications of his words. "I love you, Clara," Frederick said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I love your intelligence, your strength, your compassion, your courage. I love the way you make me feel when I'm with you, valued, understood, genuinely cared for, rather than pursued for my position." Clara stared at him in amazement, tears gathering in her eyes as the words she had never dared to hope for washed over her. "And I love you," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love your kindness, your integrity, your willingness to see value where others see only flaws. I love that you chose me when you could have had anyone, that you saw something worthwhile in a woman the world had dismissed." The kiss that followed was tender and passionate, full of promise for the future they would build together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and glowing with happiness. "Marry me, Clara," Frederick said, his voice urgent with emotion. "I know it soon, I know there will be obstacles, but I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Will you be my Duchess?" Clara looked into his earnest grey eyes and saw her future, a future filled with love, respect, purpose, and the kind of happiness she had never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered, the word carrying all the hope and joy that filled her heart. "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you." As he held her close in the darkness of the carriage, both Clara and Frederick knew that they had found something rare and precious. A love that transcended social convention, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The spinster scorned by high society was about to become the beloved Duchess of one of England's most powerful men, proving that the most beautiful love stories often bloomed in the most unlikely places. Their transformation was complete, but their greatest adventures were still to come. 1 year later, the gardens of Ravenshollow Park were in full bloom as Clara walked among the roses, her hand resting gently on her rounded belly. The past year had been a whirlwind of change, challenge, and profound happiness, culminating in a wedding that had been the talk of London, and a marriage that had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. She had not only succeeded as a duchess, but had transformed the role entirely, using her position to champion the social reforms she was passionate about. The schools for working-class children that she had discussed at Lady Ashworth's dinner party were now a reality, funded by a combination of government support and private donations that she had personally solicited. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, approached with obvious satisfaction. "The delegation from the Education Committee has arrived for your meeting. They're waiting in the blue drawing room." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll be there directly." Clara made her way toward the house, reflecting on how completely her life had changed. The woman who had once been invisible was now one of the most influential advocates for social reform in England, her opinions sought by politicians and her support courted by charitable organizations throughout the kingdom. "There you are," Frederick's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and contentment. She turned to find him approaching through the garden paths, still as handsome and commanding as ever, but with a peace in his expression that spoke of deep satisfaction with their life together. "I was just thinking about how much has changed since we first met," Clara said, accepting his embrace with the easy affection that had grown between them. "And are you happy with those changes?" Frederick asked, his hands coming to rest on her growing belly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Clara replied honestly. "You've given me everything I never dared to dream of: love, purpose, respect, and soon a child to carry on our legacy." "You've given me far more," Frederick said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've given me a reason to be better than I was, a partnership that fulfills me in ways I never knew were possible, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches." As they walked back toward the house together, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. The spinster, who had been scorned by high society, had not only found love, but had discovered her own power to make a difference in the world. Their love story had begun in the shadows of a ballroom, with a lonely duke recognizing something precious in a woman the world had dismissed. It had grown through quiet conversations and shared understanding, blossoming into a partnership that had transformed not only their own lives, but the lives of countless others. The most beautiful love story between a wealthy widowed duke and the spinster scorned by high society had proven that true love could indeed bloom anywhere, that character mattered more than beauty, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were found in the most unexpected places. As they entered their home together, both Frederick and Clara knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. They had found in each other not just love, but the courage to become the best versions of themselves, and that was a gift that would last a lifetime. The invisible woman had become visible through love, and in doing so, she had illuminated the path for countless others who had been overlooked and undervalued. Their love story would be remembered not just for its romance, but for its proof that every person possessed inherent worth, waiting only for someone with the wisdom to recognize it. Did Clara's transformation from scorned spinster to beloved duchess capture your heart? If this tale of how true love bloomed between a lonely duke and the woman society dismissed moved you, please like this story and subscribe for more captivating Regency romances. Share this with someone who believes that real beauty lies in character and compassion. Which moment touched you most? Frederick's first invitation to dance, Clara's realization of her own worth, or their beautiful legacy of love and social reform? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest romantic adventures, where love sees beyond society's cruel judgments and transforms lives forever.